of introducing our next speaker, Professor John Gilbert, widely regarded as a father figure in the field of interprofessional education and collaborative practice. Hailing from the University of British Columbia, Canada, he's a distinguished scholar who has left a lasting mark on interprofessional education, both nationally and internationally. He championed interprofessional education, revolutionizing health sciences training globally and advocating for its integration into team-based, collaborative, client-centered practice. Professor Gilbert has been honored with awards such as the Queen's Diamond Jubilee Award and is a member of the Order of Canada, recognized for his outstanding contributions. The Pioneer Award from the National Center for Interprofessional Practice and Education acknowledged his groundbreaking work in advancing interprofessional practice and education. Professor Gilbert will guide us through the profound impact of interprofessional education and collaborative practice on global policies. Please join me in extending a warm welcome to Professor John Gilbert, a true pioneer and advocate for interprofessional collaboration worldwide.
Assalamu alaikum. It's my great pleasure to welcome Your Highness, Your Excellencies, distinguished guests, colleagues, and friends. It is indeed my privilege and great pleasure to speak on the ancient lands of Qatar. I know that the journey to this day has been long and at times most frustrating for everybody who was responsible for organizing this amazing meeting. I know that we're all grateful to Qatar University for its unwavering support over a long period of time for the success of this conference. Thanks to that support and the amazing work of all of those committees that gave their time and diligence to bring this conference to fruition, we're here today. Personally, I would like to thank all of you who did that work, but especially I know that we owe an ending thanks to our Allah for her tireless attention to the 1,100 details that I know she has brought through wonderfully. Her generous, patient, and hugely good-natured attention certainly captured my heart, and I'm sure it has captured yours. We would not be here without her generosity of spirit and her organizational skills, leadership, and friendship. Shukran. When I was given the privilege of talking at this meeting, I decided that I would tell you about my entire life in 45 minutes, but actually realized that that was an impossibility. But I apologize because I did write most of it in the piece that's in the program. However, it is the privilege of the aged to change their minds, and so I hope that you will bear with me as today I talk about an issue that has been in the forefront of my attention my entire academic life of 60 years. And that is the innumerable times when I have had to contemplate policy. Now, policy making is knowing what matters and when it matters. If you have lots and lots of useful things but don't know how to use them, clearly they're never going to be enough. So let me begin with a definition. Policy is a decision framework or a course of action to achieve a desired effect or change. Policy is a decision-making framework or a course of action to achieve a desired effect or change. Now, I hope that maybe you can inscribe that on your left cortex and hold it there for the entirety of my talk. My dear friends in this audience know that I believe that history did not begin yesterday. So I'd like to begin with All Together Better Health 1997, which I was present at, which was held in the church house next to Westminster Abbey in London. Church House, as shown in this photograph, is a very collegial place, and I think there were maybe 200 of us at that particular conference that had been organized by Hugh Barr and Dr. Petroni, and I think Dr. John Holder, who was the initiator of the Center for the Advancement of Interprofessional Education in London. There was an interesting report written at the end of that meeting, which I am going to spell out for you because we're going to talk a little more about the ideas. Drawing upon experience in Europe and North America, the purpose of the conference was to explore ways in which to improve collaboration in education and practice. Sound familiar? Have you been reading it in the program? Collaboration in education and practice. And there were two propositions made which were debated by the late Dr. Bud Baldwin, a true mentor in interprofessional education, and Dr. Maddie Schmidt, Professor Emerita of Nursing now at the University of Rochester. This was the first proposition. Interprofessional education promotes collaboration. Sound familiar? Have you seen it in the program? I'll bet you have. Promotes collaboration. We had a very interesting debate on this proposition. And the second proposition, which was debated by Dr. Maddie Schmidt, was collaboration improves the quality of care. Sound familiar? Have you seen it in the program? I'll bet you have. So these two propositions are historically very interesting because prior to this meeting, there was no definition of interprofessional education for collaborative, person-centered practice and care. And these two propositions, if you reflect on them, really formed the basis of what became the definition of interprofessional education. When two or more professionals or students learn with, from, and about each other for the purposes of collaboration to improve the quality of care and services. Think about it. If you look at the program, you will see these two propositions played out in many different ways because history did not begin yesterday. When it was finally decided that it would be safe to hold this meeting in Qatar, my heart sang. And when I read the descriptions that were being proposed, I think there was a choir inside my head. So, cultivating a collaborative culture, sharing pearls of wisdom. The theme encapsulates the evolving landscape of healthcare, emphasizing the pivotal role of collaboration, visionary leadership, and transformative change in shaping the future of health education and practice. Sounds to me like the synopsis of the 1997 Altogether Better Health. I think that's amazing, positively amazing. Now, the problem with those propositions was that they formed the basis of what would ultimately become many policy decisions. And those policy decisions are with us today. When we look at the agenda universe, all of those things about which we need to make policies, you can see in the penumbra of this figure the systemic agenda, the big agenda, the kinds of things we want to do in order to change the system. And within that, we have the institutional agenda. Now, groups like us who are wanting to change the system and produce systemic change are always pushing on institutional agendas. Because what do we hear? Oh, what is this interprofessional education? We can't do it. There's no time in the syllabus. We don't have any clinical placements. And oh, what were we going to do about accreditation? So getting our voice into the institutional agenda has always been and remains a huge push issue. But once we get into the institutional agenda, as I have experienced on many occasions, the next big push is the decision agenda. How do we get the presidents of our universities, the chief executive officers of our healthcare systems, to understand that the systemic change that we would like to see made must be on the decision agenda of the organization. The chief executive officer, the president, the vice presidents, the vice executive officers have to have this on their agenda. Interprofessional collaborative practice is a way of thinking and a way of being. And it cannot be accomplished if we are not on that decision agenda. So when I look back over the years that I've been involved in this amazing activity, what I realize is that since ATBH and those two propositions, scholars of interprofessional education and collaborative practice have been probing those propositions. If you think about them, you know, there really are probable propositions because what we knew was necessary, that was that in building a discipline, we had to be sure that it could understand intellectually, that it could be challenged experimentally, that it could be argued for politically, using many policy initiatives. it didn't seem to be such a big problem to get the intellectual understanding, although we all know there's still a few problems out there. And we've done a huge number of amazing experiments. Experiments all the way from the numerical to the, hey, how do we talk about this stuff? And we have argued for it politically. But when we argue for it politically is when we really need to understand what policy is about. In my view, all policy is politics, and all politics is policy. So, IPECP has been developing standards and then policies which are the bedrock of this discipline. And I've just given you a couple of examples because I'm very close to them with my colleagues in Canada and in the United States. A whole raft of work has been done on competencies. And it certainly was a huge pleasure to see the document that was produced by the World Health Organization last year on competencies and its emphasis on collaboration. So competencies we've been working at and working at. We've been working at accreditation because what we came to understand was that in order to have what we would like to see within the university organization, the college organization, was accreditation that every health and social care professional program had to accede to. And that's been a very interesting and challenging exercise. At the same time, we've also been working in Canada on accreditation for health service facilities, because you can't just have accreditation within the academic environment, because everybody goes out and works in that environment. We need to have accreditation there. And then we've looked at legislation that embeds IPECP in health and social care systems, and that's where the policy of politics comes in. And all of these things that we've been doing have been promoting curriculum and system change. It sometimes sounds to me like it's not moving fast enough, but it's amazing how fast it has moved. And as we developed and continue to articulate competencies, accreditation protocols, legislative initiatives, then the curriculum will change even more, and there will be a system change. You all remember, I am sure, because I can't believe there is a health and social care professional who does not know about To Err is Human, the great Institute of Medicine report in the United States produced in 1999. It was a horrifying report, but it made us move fundamentally in terms of patient safety. And patient safety lit up the interprofessional capacities that would be necessary to make changes in organizational culture, to embrace new technologies that were pointed up in that report as being absolutely necessary to prevent more adverse events. Systems to prevent errors which no longer depended only on one professional. Very interesting development. The open reporting of mistakes. I call them mistakes because errors and adverse events are blaming terms, whereas mistakes are mistakes. But the open reporting of mistakes allowed us to learn by looking by root cause analysis on why those mistakes had happened. And of course, these were huge incentives for IPECP. Now, the realities are, in trying to make policy, that we have to understand some things about human nature. Other people's behavior matters. You can't enact a policy if you're not sure that somebody's behavior is not going to disrupt it. Habits are really important. Change? Who wants change? Don't we have enough problems already? But if we are going to have system change, then of course we have to encourage people to change their habits. I'm a hopeful person. I really do believe that people are motivated to do the right thing. But in order to get people to do the right thing, you have to be sure that there are policy initiatives that are fostering that motivation. And people have very clear self-expectations that influence how they behave, and we have to remember that. We also have to remember that people are very bad at computation. So I often asked, well, we want to do this. Do you think we can have it finished by Christmas? Say, well, how about Christmas 10 years down the pike? That might be more realistic. So we have to remember we have to cope with that computational problem that people have in realizing how long change takes. And of course, you cannot enact any policy unless all of those who are involved are also involved in developing the policy. The second realities are that policy doesn't follow a linear pathway. You know, many people in this audience have heard me say that it's always knight's move in chess. If you understand chess, and I apologize if you don't, you can go 1 to the front, 2 to the side, move backwards again, etc. So don't expect policy change to follow a linear pathway. We have to remember that policy is always a battle between various actors trying to please distinct constituencies. And those battles have to be managed. And in the competencies, the interprofessional competencies that we have developed, we talk a lot about managing that kind of battle. And policy disputes always include struggles about the relative influence of the interested parties. What do I mean by that? If you look at professional associations, some, which shall be nameless, have huge influence relative to others who have very little influence. And we have to recognize that when we're talking about policy change. Also, what I have learned, and I think what you probably have learned, is that policies are maintained by policy monopolies. What do I mean by that? Professional associations. Huge monopolies. And trying to change policies within professional associations, if you're not a member of that professional association, can be quite trying. Policy monopolies, of course, also include a very diverse set of actors. So if you look at a professional association, you say, they're all X's. They're not. Every one of the professional associations has a set of actors who have their own interests in whether policy can be changed. And sometimes when you're discussing policy and conflict arises, you can see only a tiny incremental change. But one tiny incremental change is one good thing, in my opinion, whatever the conflict has been. So we always expect that there will be these small changes as we move a policy initiative forward. And then the last reality is that efforts at reforming launched from outside of a monopoly are really hard. I've tried with certain professions that shall remain nameless, and I know how difficult it is to get in to change a policy. Sometimes opportunities for policy reform line up with the development of an associated policy, something that's going forward which is kind of like it, and then you can kind of machine in what it is you're trying to make a policy for. Not entirely satisfactory, but it's one that we should remember. But ultimately, the key element of policy reform is to imagine a possible reconfiguration of a policy monopoly. It happens, I'm sure in your own experiences with professional associations, you've seen this, this kind of slow change as policy reconfigures a professional association. The example, think COVID. And then finally, policies reflect and then they shape dominant social constructions. And so sound policies that support the development and sustainability of IPECP are essential for its social construction. So these policies can't be wildly off the wall about something or another unless we're thinking about how is that helping us develop the social construction of IPECP. So what about making policy a reality? Well, I've asked myself these questions, and I'll bet a nickel to a dime virtually everybody here has. When you do IPECP, who gains? There's some interesting papers at this meeting that are kind of looking at that issue. Who pays for it? Our economic analysis of these kinds of issues is abysmal. I was asked about a month ago, could you tell me how much it costs to train a medical student? I hadn't the slightest idea. And when I tried to figure it out, my ideas just kind of went to smithereens. So who pays is a critical question. Who gives their time for IPECP? At the present time, we have wonderful faculty members who essentially work pro bono to move our agenda forward. So we have to ask ourselves as policymakers, what are we going to do about that? And then who assesses the relevance and who evaluates the outcomes? Some really interesting papers at this meeting on these two issues because they are vital. We want to know 5 years downstream, if we have put something in place that is supposed to change the system, it has indeed changed the system for the patient, their caregivers, their families. All right? So these are for me, very interesting questions for Paul. Before you start anything, learn how to finish it. If I can give you a take-home message, that's the message. I see so many people who take something on and they have no way of ever finishing. So be sure you can finish. In order to kind of ensure that you can finish, you have to prepare well for changing policies. This is not something you go in on a Friday morning and say, okay, get around me, gang, we're going to do this. It takes a lot of careful preparation, and you have to plan carefully, supposing that you get that policy change, because again, 5 years downstream, what difference has it made, if any? In order to do this well, I've discovered that you have to establish and maintain contact with those who influence or make policy. And there are lots of them. I'm not a political scientist, but I know lots of policymakers, both at the federal level and at the provincial level and at the global level. And then take the pulse of the community who have an interest in this. You have to understand who's going to support and who's going to resist. And you can only do that by quietly going around and saying, oh, we have this idea that we're going to, what do you think about it? And then if they can be persuaded to support, or if they are resisting, how can you persuade them to support, and how do you persuade the persuaders in order to persuade the resistors? So having these people on side is absolutely essential to implementing policy. Now, as I said, I'm kind of a hopeaholic. I believe that we can do stuff. So be positive. Where you can, you choose tactics that emphasize the positive. And apologies to my colleague who used Sisyphus, but we all know what this means. Unless you are positive, that rock comes back down the hill again. You've got to get it over the top. And then participation, whenever you can, involve as many people as possible in strategic planning for a new policy, whatever it takes. I was asked many years ago to survey my university with respect to new directions, and it was the most awful experience. But it was absolutely essential. We did it through focus groups and questionnaires and so on and so forth. But we involved, I think, 78% of the university faculty. I think we had almost as many students in that strategic plan, which then came out in my university as Trek 2000. So get the participation and be positive. On whatever day it is, you know, however bad you feel, there are other people who maybe feel even worse. So be positive. So we're almost there, implementing. Articulate the issues around the policy clearly. Consult widely. Mediate amongst those who will and those who won't. It's a skill that took me a long time to develop, and I'm not so sure I'm great at it now, but I have a very good lawyer friend who helped me along the way. But mediation is critical in policymaking. And then be prepared to compromise. You can't get everything. I think my mother used to tell me that. My son, you can't get everything, so be prepared to compromise. And then finally agree. And in agreeing, say, we shall meet again to be sure that our agreement is holding. What do you do about publicity? Well, today we have everything at our disposal, and it's absolutely vital that when you are proposing policy change to get it as out there as much as possible. And I have to say, in IPG, we have a phenomenal organization that's really pushing all of the kinds of things that we're talking about here. And lo and behold, you can be sure I'm going to be using what we're doing in order to affect policy change in my country. And then be persistent. History did not begin yesterday. It's starting today, but it takes a long time. So be persistent. And finally, I think what we've come to understand is that effectively implementing policies really requires community competence, which is based on principles of community development and the empowerment of people on the front line. I think one of the big mistakes that we made in the early days of IPECP was to imagine that we could do it all on the campus, only to be proven wrong. It's in the community that the reality of learning together, to work together, is evidenced. So when policy matters, it matters. And I am absolutely delighted that the WHO has produced at least 4 reports that I'm aware of, but I think I have about 40 in my library. Global Strategy on Human Workforce 2030, interprofessional education's in there. The Transforming paper was absolutely instrumental, and we're in there. And then, of course, there's the framework, which I co-chaired, and I think has been incredibly successful in getting people to understand what it is that interprofessional education is about. And then finally, the Global Competency Framework that was produced last year, which is so good about collaboration, thinking back to those two propositions? Interesting. The greatest master of policy was Niccolo Machiavelli, and I recommend to you this little piece of writing of his. And it ought to be remembered that there's nothing more difficult to take in hand, more perilous to conduct, or more uncertain in its success than to take the lead in the introduction of a new order of things. Because the innovator has for enemies all of those who've done well under the old system, lukewarm defenders in those who might do well in the new system. Back to 1997, the paradox for me of real collaboration is not about getting the best minds together. You're all here in this room today. It's about creating a new mindset. Thank you for your attention, all my relations.